What do you dream about? I'm just asking because I recently went to this Dutch theme park called the Efteling. It's a fairy tale and fantasy theme park which when I visited for the first time last year I totally fell in love with. It's like someone went into my brain and made a theme park catered especially for me. It has elaborate dark rides, really cool fairy tale tableaus, beautiful forest paths you can get lost down, unnerving liminal spaces, and lots of bizarre elements. For example, you can walk into a part of the park where it's like, here are the people of laugh. There are funny species of people who live in these silly houses. Also, their father froze to death due to a miscommunication and they mourn him every day since. It's an incredibly weird theme park, but I love everything about this park. Apart from Carnival Festival. We don't talk about Carnival Festival. I want to die. But no ride was weirder in my opinion than one called Droomvlucht, which is probably the most iconic and beloved attraction in this park. It involves a journey through a magical fairy forest, which sounds simple enough, generic even, and yet I went on it and came off absolutely floored. And I knew it was capturing something really unique, but wasn't quite able to articulate what it was. But I think I've now figured it out, so let me try and explain what I think is so special about this ride. So Efteling, or the Efteling as it's respectfully called by the Dutch, actually predates Disneyland by about 3 years, although when it opened in 1952 its sole attraction was a fairy tale forest walkthrough consisting of 10 fairy tale tableaus designed by illustrator Anton Pieck. The fairy tale forest is still present in the park and continues to expand and is one of the park's most iconic and beloved attractions to this day. From 1978 onwards, the park began expanding into more conventional established theme park territory by adding other major rides and attractions, always drawing from the DNA of Pieck's original fairy tale forest. There's this common rumour that the Efteling was visited by Walt Disney to gain inspiration for Disneyland, but whilst he did go to Europe and visit other parks like Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen for research, sadly his visit to the Efteling is simply an urban myth. However, I think because of this rumour, as well as the fairy tale branding, a lot of people focus on the similarities between Disneyland and the Efteling, but personally I think it's much more interesting to examine the ways it's different to Disney. Firstly, the price, but to make a slightly less lazy comparison, it reminds me a bit of how Studio Ghibli films feel in contrast to Disney films. If you know, you know, but to elaborate a bit, Ghibli are clearly peers to Disney, and so often referred to lazily as the Disney of Japan. Stylistically, however, the films are typically a lot weirder, broadly avoid the big feelings and sentimentality of Disney films in favour of more ambiguous emotional landscapes, and have an emphasis on what Studio Ghibli director Hayao Miyazaki calls Ma, the moments where nothing happens. He clapped his hands 3 or 4 times. The time in between my clapping is Ma. If you just have non-stop action with no breathing space at all, it's just busyness. But if you take a moment, then the tension building in the film can grow into a wider dimension. I think a similar kind of comparison could be drawn between Efteling and Disney's 2 different approaches to theme park design. I think one thing that defines the Disney approach is specificity. Every inch of the park has incredibly detailed theming with lots of stimuli to create a cohesive, defined environment, whilst the Efteling in contrast has no clear-cut lands, instead having lots of greenery, emptiness and winding pathways between attractions, which give you the space to take it all in, almost like a palate cleanser. At Disney, the attractions usually have clear emotional cues where you feel the exact emotion at the exact time they want you to. Unless you're one of those cynical dads wearing a t-shirt about how much you hate your wife and you don't want to be there. Whilst at the Efteling, the attractions have this weird, kind of gothic tone that doesn't seem afraid to make you feel unsure and uncomfortable about how you're meant to feel. In a good way. Except on Carnival Festival, which is uncomfortable in a bad way. I'm not trying to argue one is better than the other here, they're just different approaches to theme park design. One thing I thought was really cool though is how proud and enthusiastic a lot of the people I spoke to in the Netherlands were about the Efteling. It's an authentic part of Dutch culture in a way that Disneyland Paris obviously isn't of French culture. The Efteling feels as Dutch as cycling everywhere, Unoxbroges and Gezelligheid. I think I butchered the pronunciation of that one. In my conversations about the Efteling with Dutch people I encountered, one thing I heard repeatedly was that every ride told a story. This was a particular point of pride. But I'm not sure that's the case. Whilst almost every ride at Efteling had really compelling placemaking and atmosphere, I found the idea that every ride told a story wasn't as true as I was led to believe, but I think that's a good thing. So Droomvlucht is an indoor ride that opened in 1993, an ethereal fantasy-themed ride in which the story is... well, there isn't one. Droomvlucht was designed by Ton van de Ven, who was the creative director of the Efteling from 1974 to 2003. He designed most of the attractions that opened in this period in which the park expanded beyond the fairy tale forest, but his visual style was still heavily influenced by the gothic feel of the original fairy tale forest vignettes, designed by his predecessor, Anton Pieck. One notable departure in terms of design approach from Pieck was Van de Ven's rejection of telling linear stories in the attractions he designed, with only a couple of his attractions telling a clear story. The majority of his attractions instead focused on creating an evocative series of images that establish a distinct environment and tone. I'm a big advocate that theme park rides can be really effective without a story, but what's interesting about Droomvlucht in particular is how important the lack of story is to the experience the ride is creating. So when I went to the Efteling for the first time, I intentionally under-researched this park so I could experience the attractions as blindly as possible. I was literally wandering around without a map, walking into random buildings without even reading the signs outside, and then would be surprised when I would find out if it was a show or a roller coaster or a dark ride. Due to this total lack of research, after I rode Droomvlucht for the first time, I thought I had this really interesting, cool, radical interpretation of the attraction, thinking that the ride had this surreal quality that made it feel like I was dreaming. And then I looked up what the name Droomvlucht means in English, and it translates to dream flights. And then I found out the ride's tagline is dreaming with your eyes open. So yeah, my hot take was extremely lukewarm. The ride had achieved very effectively exactly what it set out to do. But I think how it achieves this is still very impressive, because I think it's incredibly hard to make a theme park ride or any art that genuinely feels representative of what dreams feel like. So how does Droomvlucht, or Dreamflight, do this? The biggest film ever made about dreams is unfortunately Inception, a movie my friend Harry Robertson once described as a film about dreams made by a man who I'm pretty sure does not dream. I'm a bit more sympathetic to our boy Chris Nolan, but Inception is a great example of a good film that does absolutely nothing to make the dreams within it feel like dreams, but to capture that nonsensical, surreal yet powerful vibe is a difficult job. I think the problem with a lot of media about dreams is it tries to have some kind of coherent narrative or clear meaning, whilst dreams are often defined by their incohesion, although still feeling like they sort of make sense whilst you're experiencing them. So the decision for Droomvlucht to have a complete lack of story plays in its favour of achieving this effect. Rather than drawing on any existing fairy tale we already recognise, it's quite hard to describe the story and experience of this ride in the same way it's difficult to describe a dream, an intentional design decision from Van de Ven. There's ways that this ride reflects this dream state in more obviously cliche ways, such as the ride loading area looking sort of like a child's bedroom, and the mist at the start and the end of the ride indicating the transition to and from the dream world. The more interesting ways are the less obvious ones, such as the way the ride is structured. To give a quick overview of each of the 5 main scenes of the ride, it begins with the castle realm where 4 castles in the distance are lit up by the sunset, followed by 2 similar scenes, the Wondrous Forest and the Fairy Garden, where you travel past a forest filled with fairies and other magical creatures. The ride then enters a starry tunnel before entering the Heavenly Castle scene, where moons covered with castles float through space, before you return to the forest for the final scene, this time in a rainy swamp filled with trolls, and the ride vehicle spirals downwards 13 meters before you enter a misty tunnel and the ride ends. What's interesting is that the sequencing of these scenes feels fairly disconnected from each other in an intentionally abstract way. There's multiple scenes set in a fairy tale forest, and then inexplicably sandwiched in the middle is a celestial space scene. To go from the forest to space is surprising, but the starry tunnel transition makes it feel somewhat logical. But to then immediately switch back from space to the forest feels nonsensical in the best possible way. I think part of why this works is almost this feeling of dream logic. Space is the highest point you could possibly be, and for this scene to be immediately followed by the fast spiral back down from the height towards the forest floor may not make logical sense, but it feels right somehow. You're dropping down from space. Tell me that's not dream logic. The speed of this final scene is another unexpected delirious delight, and an oddly perfect finale for the ride, which also debatably makes the ride a coaster, which for nerds on the internet is great to have a pointless argument about. We're all aware of having nightmares which scare us so much they wake us up, but often I have dreams which aren't necessarily scary, but are more positive, thrilling, and exciting, which wake me up in a similar way. Wait, not like that. I mean flying, or running, or riding a roller coaster. Do you think I might be a bit obsessed with theme parks? In the same way, the speed at the end of the ride mirrors this excitement that wakes you up from a dream, with a thrilling descent out of the dream world, especially in contrast to the more relaxed, steady pace of the rest of the ride. Not only is the pace of the rest of this ride fairly slow, but the ride has a vehicle that is suspended overhead, which means you fly over scenes without it touching the ground. This makes sense when the ride is called Dreamflight, but the way it's used is quite different to other rides using this kind of suspended vehicle. Notably, we don't pass over the top of any scenes to look at from above, like most rides used in the system. Instead, we are always at the side looking outwards at each of the scenes. If needed, the ride vehicle could be replaced with a classic ride vehicle anchored to the ground, and none of the scenes would have to change. So why choose this ride vehicle? Here it's less about flying in the euphoric sense of feeling like you're Superman or Peter Pan, but instead creating that surreal sense of disconnection you feel while floating from moment to moment within a dream. One thing that is very striking is the really dense, highly detailed, debatably chaotic nature of these scenes, in which the focus of each scene is typically unclear, but you slowly discover more as you observe. This design approach was drawing inspiration from the works of Dutch artists such as Peter Bruegel and Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights in particular to me seems quite similar in its approach, appearing quite overwhelming at first, but rewards closer inspection and appreciation of each of the many details within it. I've probably ridden Droomvlucht about 5 times, and each ride I've spotted some small new detail which is a total delight. It's like finding an extra fry at the bottom of your McDonald's bag. It would be very difficult to see everything on one ride, and so the ride rewards that repeated engagement. And when you look closer, there's some weird stuff in these scenes. There's some kind of forest thing, butt naked, having a shower, and there's a random talking tree, which I think is just a shameless rip-off of the one at Tato Park.
If I were a tree, what a tree I'd be.
It's these small bizarre details that don't particularly draw attention to themselves that add to that dreamlike state, stuff that feels like it makes sense as long as you don't closely examine or think about it too much. The fairies and other creatures in these scenes, instead of being fully articulated animatronics, are instead figures with limited movements. The fairies in particular have this aesthetic reminiscent of vintage dolls, in a way that feels nostalgic yet unsettling, almost like a child is dreaming about their own toys. Looking at these, I genuinely feel unsure of how they make me feel, but I also find them utterly transfixing. This weird, ambiguous tonality which permeates the whole ride is most firmly reinforced by the ride's score. I think in a lot of visual media, score can be one of the firmest indicators of what you should be feeling, but here I feel like it plays a slightly different role. I don't understand music theory, so this is going to be based purely on vibes. So this is a flying dark ride attraction which, at least on a surface level, is similar to both Disney's Peter Pan's Flight and Universal's E.T. Adventure. This is what the music is like on Peter Pan's Flight. Obviously, we do have pre-existing associations with the music because of the film, but I think even without that, you could clearly listen to this music and describe the joyous, uplifting, triumphant feeling it creates. Similarly, on the E.T. Adventure, this is how the music sounds. Again, whilst coming with baggage from the movie, John Williams is the king of evoking extremely specific emotions through his compositions. I feel this euphoric, magical, and exhilarating feeling every time I hear this piece. And here is the music from Droomvlucht. This feels harder to describe. It definitely feels magical. There's something weirdly nostalgic about it, but there's also a sense of unease. It's not clearly happy or sad, and there's a level of ambiguity to the emotional state it's creating. This is especially stark in comparison to the razor-focused emotional precision of those other pieces of music, in the same way those rides have extreme emotional clarity. Droomvlucht instead is creating a less specific emotional landscape. This score, along with the whole ride, rejects telling you what you should feel and when you should feel it. This is a ride almost defined by ambiguity, ambiguous place, ambiguous story, ambiguous tone, and even ambiguous emotions. It reminds me a bit of when you have a dream and you're trying to figure out what it means, and then you Google it and you find out it means you're pregnant or something. Even when you know, at least in my case, that's not possible. And instead you're left with the realization that there is no firm objective higher meaning of your dream. Sure, it's a reflection of your subconscious, but your own interpretation of what you think it means is all you can take away from it. In Droomvlucht, all of the different aspects come together to create a strange, ambiguous, surreal experience, or dare I say it, masterpiece. which is probably one of the only pieces of art I've come across that truly felt like it captures what it feels like to dream. And as I'm getting older, my dreams are becoming less fantastical. I have so many dreams about meetings and deadlines and Microsoft Excel, which I don't think would make a good theme park ride. And that makes sense. Our experiences and memories are a big part of what makes up our dreams. But that unbridled imagination is also a key aspect, which I think Droomvlucht captures so well. All that possibility and fantasy and dazzling imagery. But we can influence our dreams, and I want to learn how to dream more like Droomvlucht. Unlock that wild imagination, but also be willing not to have to find the answers in everything. Not everything needs an answer, right? Plus, I think it'd be pretty funny if my dreams had butt-naked little forest creatures running around in them. Anyway, I think I got a bit sidetracked. What do you dream about?